The Washington Parents Network recently filed a Title IX complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and Washington State Superintendent of Public Instruction Chris Reykdal and Governor Bob Ferguson were named in the complaint. Here with more on this is the Center Square's Washington reporter Carlene Johnson. Carlene, what is this complaint about?
Yeah, this was filed again by the Washington Parents Network on Friday, the 28th of February. And the main concern from this group is that, by the way, they've been working on the complaint for nearly a year, hoping that they wouldn't have to file, according to the executive director, David Spring. But their contention is that now that President Trump, one of his many executive orders early on was to say, you must abide by Title IX, made federal law 53 years ago to protect women and girls in education opportunities and in athletics. As most of the listeners know, we've had, the last couple of years with a number of trans athletes wanting to participate in sports. So it's become a hugely controversial issue, not just here in Washington, but in many other states. So that was one of the very first things that President Trump implemented under executive order, said you will abide by Title IX. There won't be boys and girls sports. You may recall, in his initial speech was there are two genders. There are boys and there are girls and there isn't anything else. In Washington State, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction under the direction of State Superintendent Chris Reykdal has directed school districts across the state not to comply with the president's directive, saying that under state law, the claim is there are not just two sexes, that it's biological fact, according to Superintendent Reykdal, that, in Washington State, these students can identify the gender of their choosing and can participate in sports, use a girl's bathroom if they identify as a female. And so there have been several school districts in Washington State, more likely on the central and eastern half of the state, where there are more conservative districts, that have said, wait a minute, there's a contradiction now between federal law and state law, and we're in jeopardy potentially of losing federal funding, hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, and state funding for these districts, saying, okay, so what do we do? There's now a contradiction. So that was the genesis of the complaint filed by the Washington Parents Network and signed onto by many of the school board directors in these more conservative districts that say, hey, wait a minute, we've got a real issue here with the contradiction between state and federal guidance.
And you did ask the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction about this and about the contradiction and funding. What did they have to say?
Yeah, that was the really interesting part, is because after the article published on Friday the 28th, I received some correspondence with Katie Payne, the lead in communications of the Office of State Superintendent Chris Reykdal, and she took issue with my article and said that one of the school board directors from the Enumclaw School District, who was signed a declaration in the complaint, and I used one of his quotes in my article where he said, they are concerned that state funding is in jeopardy. Katie Payne with Reykdal's office said, that's not the threat. We've never made that threat in our letter to the school districts. And by the way, I should have mentioned that those letters that were sent from Reykdal's office to the school districts in non-compliance gave them until March the 24th to come into compliance. It did not specifically spell out what the penalty for non-compliance will be, but the school board directors contend that based on the threat from Reykdal's office during COVID, when some of these school districts, were saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to have to force our teachers to get the COVID vaccine. We don't want to have to abide by continued mask mandates. At that point, Reykdal's office did, and I included that in my article as well, threaten the withholding of state funding for non-compliance. Well, that directive has never been pulled back. So the school board directors in the complaint are saying it's the threat is there of the withholding of state funding for non-compliance now in this case. So that's what they base that on. So I went back to Katie Payne in Reykdal's office and said, if in fact state funding is not being threatened for those districts that don't comply, what is the consequence? What is the penalty? And at this point, I have not received any response back specifically detailing what the consequence for noncompliance is going to be.
So where do things stand now?
Yeah, that is an ongoing question, right? Because I was told by David Spring with the Washington Parents Network that some of these school districts, and apparently there's about 20 of them in central and eastern Washington and a couple in western Washington that are, in this non-compliance category. I was told there was going to be a meeting of these school board directors on Wednesday evening, the 5th. Now, whether or not there was going to be any decision made after that to uniformly say, okay, we're all going to push this and not comply because we believe we have federal law on our side under President Trump. I am waiting to find out what that decision is going to be. But some of those school districts, including the Moses Lake School District, they have already said on the record, they don't intend to comply. They're going to keep boys out of girls' sports. They're going to keep boys out of girls' locker rooms and restrooms. And they will, continue to kind of push the issue because they believe the federal law supersedes the state law in this case. And they don't intend to comply by the deadline of March 24th given by Superintendent Reykdal. So, waiting to find out at this point, Eliana, just exactly what the plan is going to be for these non-compliant school districts. And then what if, they don't comply? What does the superintendent intend to do? I am going to be writing a follow-up article in the next couple of days because I'm having some conversations with some of these school board directors, and I'm waiting for further response from the superintendent's office. And so it's a hugely important issue. Like I said, not just here in Washington state, lots of other states are dealing with this. And so we also know we've got the eyes of the Trump administration on Washington state over this very issue. And so it's going to be interesting to follow. I promise that we'll stay right on top of it.
Well, Carlene, thank you for your insights on this story. And like you said, our listeners can continue to follow this at thecentersquare.com.